Daniel chapter 5, look at verse 1. We've been studying the book of Daniel, and we're going to keep plugging along at it. Chapter 6 deals with Daniel in the lion's den, so I'm looking forward to that. And then I'm scared about chapter 7. Chapter 7 is where he really starts talking about a lot of his prophecies and stuff like that. So I'm not sure how that'll translate into Sunday morning preaching. And you just pray with me about that. We'll see what God does there. But let's look at verse 1. Belshazzar, the king, made a feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the thousands. Now, remember the king prior to this was Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is now gone. He's passed on. And so we'll talk about the succession of kings in just a moment. But now Belshazzar, which we believe to be his grandson, is now the king. And as we continue to read here, I want you to notice how the Bible is going to emphasize the drinking that he was doing here. It says that he drank wine before the thousand. Verse 2, Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might, notice this, drink therein. Okay, so you're going to find as we read that doing this was not a good thing. This really bothered God, and we'll talk about in the sermon why that bothered God. But you'll understand he did that under the influence. Now, let me, before we go on and say, there have been a lot of people that have done and said a lot of stupid things because they were under the influence of alcohol. And so we can just say that. This isn't the sermon, but we should just say it here. That's why I believe in not drinking at all. Well, didn't Jesus turn water into wine? I'm so sick of that argument. For one, I could debate with you whether it was fermented. Number two, even if that was the case then, it's totally different from the vodka and the Budweiser you're drinking today. It's just stop. And if you're going to use Jesus as an excuse for your sin, you're really using the wrong person, all right? So don't find somebody else to justify your unwise choices. Hey, that was free preaching. That didn't even cost you anything, all right? But it just gripped me. I want you to see that. It'll emphasize, you'll see a bunch more as we go on and read. And some of you are saying, well, get on with it so I can sit down. Okay, I am. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines, drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass, of iron, of wood and of stone. In the same hour came forth fingers. This is where, man, it turns. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Okay, so again, a hand appears, just a hand, and starts writing in the wall. All right, so I'm sure he's a little tipsy. Whoa. But then you'll see he sobers up real quick. I mean, black coffee's got nothing on God's hand showing up, okay? So this is what he says. Then the king's countenance was changed. I think we could put there, he sobered up. And his thoughts troubled him. Notice this, so that the joints of his loins were loosed. Now stop right there. What does that mean? I think he might have wet himself. No, I'm serious. The joints of his loins were loosed. Oh, and then it says there, and his knees smote one against another. I mean, he's having some issues here. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers and the Chaldeans and the soothsayers. Oh, here we go again. He tries to bring all these people in to explain what was going on, but none of them could. Now look at verse 10. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. I like this. There's a man in the kingdom that you don't know about, in whom the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of gods, was found in him. Whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father the king, I say thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. For as much as an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hard sentences, and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let the king, let Daniel be called, and he will show thee the interpretation. You don't know about this guy. He's done this more than once in the kingdom. All right, flip over to verse 25 real quick. So Daniel comes in, and he looks at what's written on the wall, and he interprets it. And this is the writing that was written, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and are given to the Medes and the Persians. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. In that night was Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Lord, bless the preaching this morning. Help us to learn something. Thank you for these folks, and it's in your name I pray. Amen. Thank you. You may be seated. I appreciate you standing so long. We live in an increasingly biblically illiterate society. But yet, I know we live in a postmodern culture, so it's debatable whether we are a Christian nation or not. I understand that. But you can see the influence of Christianity in our culture. There are references on a regular basis by people that don't even know the Bible. For instance, it's coming March. I like college basketball, and so the March Madness, the basketball tournament will take place, and you will inevitably hear somebody mention David versus Goliath in that tournament. You hear that. You'll hear people that don't go to church, that really don't know the Lord. They'll maybe say this sometime. They'll say, well, a little birdie told me. Have you ever heard somebody say that? Where's that come from? That comes from the Bible. That expression is used in the Bible. Be careful what you say, because a bird might carry it on its wings and go off. So that's why you be careful what you say about somebody behind closed doors. A little birdie might tell them, right? Y'all with me this morning? Because I've found that, you go to somebody and you say, hey, listen, don't tell anybody. Whoever you say that to is always going to tell at least one person. And they will go to that one person, they will say, hey, don't tell anybody. Oh, I promise I won't. And they'll tell one person. Oh, we call that a little birdie. That's a biblical reference. Somebody might say, well, that's my cross to bear. That's a biblical reference, all right? Have you ever heard this before? Have you ever heard somebody say this? Oh, the handwriting is on the wall. The handwriting is on the wall. Now, what are they saying? A lot of times people will say the handwriting is on the wall, and they have never read the book of Daniel in their life. They know nothing about Babylonians. They have never even heard of Belshazzar and his feast, but yet they will say the handwriting is on the wall. Well, that comes from this chapter. Obviously, as we just read, a hand comes out, writes it on the wall, and that handwriting sealed the doom of this king. And so we say that, oh man, you're about to lose your job. The handwriting is on the wall, or whatever it is. We know that it signifies impending doom is coming. Let's talk about this judgment in this text for just a moment this morning. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC. And according to history, he was succeeded by a man named Evil Merodach. Now, how would you like to be named Evil Merodach? And the only thing I could keep thinking of is growing up in the late 70s, early 80s was Evil Knievel. That's all I could keep thinking of. But then you have all these evil kings, but that was his name. He only reigned 2 years before he was murdered. Then the man who plotted his murder was a man named Neriglissar, and he ruled for 4 years. Then another man named Labashai Marduk ruled for 2 months. And then a man named Nabonidus became king. This, we believe, was Belshazzar's father. Now, in the text, you'll notice that he called Nebuchadnezzar his father several times. Well, we would use that reference. We'd say this refers to our fathers, our founding fathers, our forefathers. You can use that expression to refer to the generations before you, not necessarily your biological earthly father. And so that's kind of what we believe, although it's very reasonable to surmise also that it was literally that Nebuchadnezzar was literally Belshazzar's father. But I want you to understand that this man, Nabonidus, who we believe to be the king of Belshazzar, he didn't like, according to history, he didn't like running the country. It just wasn't his thing. He kind of got bored being at home and running the country. And so he was more of a pioneering spirit, and he would go out at times, and he would want to conquer foreign lands, and he would want to lead armies, and he was just more of an adventurous type. So he leaves his son, Belshazzar, to run the country. Now you say, well, where are you getting all of that? Well, you saw down in verse 25, somewhere around there, that after the handwriting is interpreted, that this man, Belshazzar, makes Daniel, he makes him third in command. Well, why did he make him third in command? Well, because he was only second in command. All right? His father, the one that was out conquering, was the main man. He was the second man, and so he makes Daniel the third man. That's kind of the idea many Bible students and scholars have come to understand, and it makes sense to me. Now, maybe you've ever heard this before. Nero, the Caesar and emperor of Rome. Have you ever heard this, that Nero fiddled while Rome burned? Have you ever heard that statement in history? While Rome was burning, he was playing the fiddle. And while Nero fiddled while Rome burned, it's reasonable to understand here that Belshazzar feasted while Babylon fell. Here he has this massive party, and we've all already made allusion to it seems to be some kind of drunken party of immorality and debauchery. And that's interesting because the dining room, I'm told, I've never seen it, we wouldn't have pictures or documentation of that, but there's record and historical record that the dining room alone was said to be 1,650 feet wide, and it was to be a mile long. Now that's a big banquet hall. Now we studied Esther together, and remember they partied for like 6 months. So I mean, if these people were going to do something like that, I mean, it makes sense that you have 1,650 feet by 5,280 feet in a mile. I mean, that is massive. And in fact, one historian was recording that what they would do is that they trained peacocks, and they made these little chariots, and they would put food and wine on these little chariots, and these trained peacocks would bring the food by your table. How awesome is that? Our next Valentine's banquet, we're getting peacocks. That's how we do it at First Baptist Church, man. I mean, these guys are just getting drunk, and they're eating, and they're reveling, and they're just living a debauched, immoral party. And so in their drunkenness, they call for these vessels that they had taken captive when they seized Judah. Now, let me just say this. Don't be blinded by the party of the world. I mean, look at it. I mean, this is big. This is fancy. There's peacocks. There's the finest wine, the finest food. I mean, there's women, and it's just all this is going on. And don't be fooled by the party. As I've already mentioned, just like alcohol makes you say and do foolish things you wouldn't otherwise do, the world isn't showing you what's behind all of that. Y'all tracking me this morning a little bit? I know the beer commercial shows, the dorky, nerdy guy that buys a beer and gets the beautiful girl. But they don't show you the broken home. They don't show you the abuse. They don't show you the wasted money. They don't show you, heaven forbid, the homeless man in the street that reeks of alcohol and vomit. Look, don't be blinded by the party. Everything wasn't hunky-dory in this man's life. Herodotus was known as the father of history. We called him that because he was the first real historian to kind of write down his thoughts and systematically organize them. He said that the city of Babylon was surrounded by a wall that was 350 feet high and 87 feet thick, which was wide enough for 6 chariots to ride abreast across this wall. Not only was the wall high and thick, they had 250 watchtowers, strategically. I'm not talking about the watchtowers that are on the corners in Long Beach. I'm talking about like real ones. And they had 250 strategically placed watchtowers providing security for the city. And not only that one of the wonders of the world, one of the wonders of the ancient world was the hanging gardens of Babylon. And so here's this king. He's in his massive banquet hall. He's got all these thousands of friends around him. I mean, the liquor is flowing and the food and the entertainment, and he's living up all this pleasure. And he knows the Medes and Persians are surrounding the city, but he's like, what do I care? I mean, have you seen those walls? There's a moat around Babylon where the river Euphrates drains in. They got to come across the moat. We've got 250 watchtowers. We've got the strongest army in the world. We've got walls so thick that chariots can race around them. What's to worry about? Let's live it up. I got a picture of let me put that graphic up. I mean, can you imagine this? I mean, this is just an idea. We don't know exactly, but you see the hanging gardens coming over, and you see the moat around it, and this is just an image to put in your mind. And right in the middle of that's this banquet hall, and this guy's just like, I've got nothing to worry about. If there was ever a place to feel safe and secure, it would have been in a place like this. It would have been in Babylon. But the king, he was about to learn some lessons that he should have learned a long time ago. Because this night at this party, God was about to take him to school. And I want to give you today, in the time that I have, and I might not get through it all, and that's okay, we're not in a rush. But I want to give you 4 lessons, or 4 subjects the king failed in. And how many school wasn't your thing? You didn't do so hot in school, all right? Well, we all probably failed in some subjects and struggled in others. Maybe math wasn't your strong suit or whatnot. But here's some subjects that this king, he just failed in. And God was taking him back to school. Number 1, he failed his history lesson. Now, I don't know about you. I don't know if you like history or not. In school, I didn't really care for history all that much. But once I graduated and got out and started teaching myself and reading and so forth, I love history. I love American history in particular. I just enjoy history. This king failed in history. Again, I believe that it makes logical sense that Belshazzar's grandfather was Nebuchadnezzar. Now, he might have been a younger man at this time, but he heard the stories. He heard how Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And he had this dream of this giant statue, and he kept having it over and over and over, a head of gold and a chest of silver and loins of brass and feet of iron and clay. And he kept having this dream over and over and over again. And so he calls all of his soothsayers in and his magicians, and he says, I'm having a dream, and you're going to tell me what the dream was, and you're going to tell me what it means. And nobody could do it. But in walks a young Daniel. Daniel says, hey, here's the dream you're having. And he tells him to a T exactly what that dream was, and he interprets it for him. Belshazzar heard that story. Any of you have a grandparent that tells the same stories over and over and over and over again? My grandma, she's gone on to be with the Lord now, passed away maybe about 2 years ago. And I remember my grandma, we'd get together at Thanksgiving. And my grandma, she was a jolly person. She just always chuckling and jolly. And I remember you'd be sitting around the table and she'd say, did I ever tell you that story about when you were 5 years old and you said, and I'd say, yeah, we called her, we were from the South a little bit, so we called her Mamaw. Yeah, Mamaw, you told us that story. And you know what, I don't know if your grandma was like this, but that didn't faze her at all. It didn't matter that I'd heard that the last, 18 Thanksgivings in a row. And it didn't matter that she asked me if I had heard it before. It was a rhetorical question. She didn't care what the answer was. She said, have you heard that story? And what she was really saying is, I'm about to tell you this story. And we sat there and we listened to her tell the story. And when it got to what you said when you were 5 years old and now you're kind of embarrassed and your brother's making fun of you, you just kind of all chuckled and listened to Grandma tell her story. Now, don't you think for a second that Nebuchadnezzar told these fellas these stories? Don't you think he said, man, there's this one time I didn't listen to that dream interpretation. I built this humongous statue. I told everybody they're going to bow down to it. And there's these 3 boys, and they weren't going to do it. And I threatened them, and I pitched a fit, and I yelled at them,
and they still weren't going to do it. And I threw those dudes in the fire after I chained them up, and man, there were 4 people walking around in there. And you're not going to believe this, when they came out of there, the chains it was so hot, it killed the people that threw them in there. Yeah, Grandpa, you told us that. That's kind of like going to school uphill both ways to school in the snow, right? No, I'm telling you, those chains were melted off, and when those guys came out, their hair wasn't singed. Oh man, talking about singeing hair. Last night I grilled some chicken on my grill, and I hadn't used it in a while. I singed everything on this arm. Whoa, yeah. It was, you ever smelled that? They said, you didn't smell that on those guys. It didn't singe their hair. They didn't even smell like wood smoke. Yes, Grandpa. I could go on with these stories, but we don't have time. This man had heard the stories. So here's a question I have for you. Why didn't he learn from the mistakes of other people? See, as the years passed, Nebuchadnezzar's words were forgotten, and his grandson treated God with an arrogant disrespect. Remember, he could have told him the story about how he lived like a beast for 7 years, and how he finally came to faith in the one true God. Yeah, Grandpa, I know I should believe in your God. I know I should worship with you. I know, Grandpa, I should go to church. No, he treated God with an arrogant disrespect and disdain. I'm going to tell you, this is what struck me. When the queen comes in, which many believe that would have been his mother, comes in and says, hey, there's a man named Daniel. When I'm reading this, I'm thinking, it is unthinkable that this man did not know who Daniel was. How can you not know who Daniel was? You think about it, if Daniel was 16 years old when Judah was taken captive by Babylon in 605 BC, and Babylon fell in 539, which was right here, that means Daniel's 82 years old at the time. He's been around a while, and he's done a lot of things. He's an important player in the culture of Babylon, and this little punk didn't even know who he was. I'm going to tell you, too often, younger leaders are so concerned about themselves and the present that they don't consider the future. That's why he's partying. That's why he's spending money. That's why he's living it up. And that's the same thing the culture is doing today. Our young people have no concept about tomorrow. They have no concept about growing up and getting a job and saving their money and doing something with their life. No, they rather just live it up right now. And they don't think of anything about the past. They don't think of anything about what's going on in the future. They make the same mistake about the past. What is it that George Santayana said? The philosopher said, those who do not remember the past are condemned to relive it. Right? Now I understand. Let me just kind of bring this down, and maybe we'll just preach this first point, and that's fine with me. But we can't live in the failures of the past. So we're talking about history lesson. We can't sit around and live in the failures of the past. That would simply paralyze us. How many people do that? You know, they think that because they weren't a good father back here, that it's kind of like they can't do it now. Or maybe because they didn't have a good example of a father, that they're not capable of being. And they let the failures of the past paralyze them in the future. Hey, there are a lot of people that come into church here today, and because there was a mistake in your past, it keeps you from growing in the Lord. You can't do that. You can't live in the past. You can't live in your failures back then. And we make the same mistake when we try and live in the successes of the past. There's so many people that paralyzes them too. Well, back in 1973, man, I'm glad you did something for the Lord in 1973. That's fantastic. But this ain't 1973. You can't live in 1973. I used to drive a bus. Well, drive a bus now. I used to sing in the choir. You can't live in what you used to do. And there are a lot of people that are doing that. So they let bad relationships, bad church experiences, personal failures paralyze them because they failed in the past, or they live in some great mountaintop experience and they keep that from them doing something in the past. I'm telling you, we have to use history as a reference point. Somebody said this way, your past is either going to be an anchor that holds you down, or it's going to be a rudder that guides you through. But this guy was so focused about his present that he didn't do anything. He didn't learn from the past, and he didn't prepare for the future. You see, he was a slow learner, and he refused to do his lessons. Now, his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, or his father, Nebuchadnezzar, he was a slow learner, but at least he learned. What did he learn? He learned that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men. He learned it the hard way, but he learned it. But Belshazzar had not learned it, and he was refusing to learn it. He's like a lot of young people today. They're totally unmindful of the past. They're totally unintelligent in the present. And they're totally unprepared for the future. That describes a big part of our generation today. So here's some practical thoughts that I want to give you. Number one, glean from the wisdom of past generations. Glean from the wisdom of past generations. They got a lot to offer. Now, I'm a preacher, and so I enjoy preaching a lot. I love preaching. I love hearing preaching. There's two kinds of preaching that makes me want to preach. When I hear good preaching, I want to preach. And I was at a conference this past week. On Tuesday night, I heard some preaching. Man, I couldn't wait to get back here Wednesday night and preach myself. Good preaching makes me want to preach. The other kind of preaching that makes me want to preach is bad preaching. And I hear somebody's a bad preacher, I say, get out of the way, I want to preach, you know. And so I just like preaching, and I like being around preachers. I'll tell you, sometimes you get around some younger preachers sitting there with older preachers, and then the younger preachers just yak. Shut up. I don't know if you've ever heard of Bobby Robertson. Bobby Robertson's in his 80s. He's pastored the same church 60 plus years. He's a great man of God. I had lunch with Bobby Robertson once. I was roommates with his grandson. And I was able to go to a conference. I stayed in his grandson's house, and I sat and ate. He said, you want to eat lunch with my grandpa? Man, absolutely, man. Here I am. I'm working on my master's degree in college. Man, I knew a lot. And I was sitting there at the table with some other great preachers, well-known preachers, and there's Bobby Robertson. And literally, I'm sitting next to Bobby Robertson. I couldn't wait to get back to college and tell all my friends that I had a conversation with Bobby Robertson. I'm just glad they didn't ask me, what did he say? Because he said, hey, can you pass the salt and pepper? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That was the extent of our conversation. Now, do you think that I was going to sit there at that table with those preachers and say, well, let me tell you what I learned last week in my class? No, you shut up and you listen. Because the preacher, and you say, well, I'm not a preacher. Okay. But you know, that's the wonderful thing that I love about a church. You know, sometimes people say this about church. They say, well, there's no young people. There's no young people at the church. Okay, wait, hold on a second. If you are under the age, if you are 29 and younger, would you stand up? Come on, help me out. 29 or younger, stand up. 29 or younger, stand up. Okay, so, look around. There are young people in our church. All right, thanks. You can sit down. All right, so that kind of gets on my nerves because somebody said, well, there's no young people in the church. Well, so I don't want to come to church. There are no young people there. Well, why don't you come to church and you can be the first one then? Because you got to start somewhere, right? I remember when I was in college, we'd want to play tackle football. And so me and my buddy and one other buddy would say, hey, we're going to play tackle football. And you'd go to the room next to you and say, hey, we're going to play tackle football. And they say, who you got playing? Us three? Well, that ain't enough. Well, look here, knucklehead. If you would agree, that'd make 4. And then we can go to the next room and get 5 and 6. We can go upstairs and get 7 and 8 until we have some people to play with. Y'all tracking me? So if you're under 30 and you don't have no singles around there, then why don't you stay here and we can collect some? All right, now if you're, I don't want to offend anybody. if you're 60 or older and you're physically able to stand, would you stand? Come on, I made the young people do it. You can do it too. Okay. Well, thank you. All right, thank you. You may be seated. Okay, so here's a biblical concept for you. You know, the Bible says that the aged women, now I'm not saying what's aged. You know if you're aged or not. The aged women are to teach the younger. What are they supposed to teach them? How to love their husbands and be keepers of the home. Hey, look, I'm telling you, we just had almost equal amounts of under 29 and under, 60 and older stand. You know, it would be wise if some of us that are trying to raise children would go to somebody who has actually raised children and say, hey, how'd you deal with your teenagers? Hey, I've noticed that you have a very close-knit family. Hey, I've noticed that some of your children are serving the Lord. What are some things that you did to create family unity? Hey, I've noticed you've been married for 55 years, and it seems like there's still a little bit of, I don't know, spark in that relationship. Because I know some people that have been married 35, 40, 50 years, and I mean, they're in love. I'd like to say, hey, how'd you do that? Tell me some things. You see, we ought to take heed to our history lessons because they've got a lot to offer. Now, let me say this. Just because you're over 60 doesn't mean you're right about everything. Because there's a lot of people, the older they live, bless God, I know what I'm talking about. Hey, just because you lived a long time doesn't mean you know everything. Now, what I'm trying to tell the younger generation is I think you know a lot. Because we can't gain on you and your experience. You're always ahead of us. So you know a lot. That's a good thing. But you don't know everything. And just because you're young doesn't mean you don't know anything either. And isn't that the battle between generations? Let me tell you, this generation today, these little whippersnappers, they don't know nothing. You know, no, actually they do. They know a few things. But the younger generation looking at the older one going, bunch of dusty, old, cranky people. I'm just saying. I'm in the middle. I can talk like this. I got more gray hairs than black ones. I can talk like this. What I'm saying is they may not always be right, but they do have a perspective that we don't have. How about this? And we'll get out of here on this. Learn from the mistakes of the past generations. I said in the previous point, I was making a point, hey, there's some people that raised kids and they did a good job. You ought to learn from them. They got a strong marriage. You ought to learn from them. But you know what? There are some in the previous generation, they didn't do so good. So why don't you learn from their mistakes? Why don't you not do the same thing they did? Listen, look, don't get nervous. I'm not going to ask you to stand or raise your hand or anything. But there are some people in this room, you got into the drug and the party scene, and you saw what it brought you. You know what? You could be a testimony to somebody and say, hey, look, man, I've been down that road. Take it from me. You don't want to go down there. There's been people in this room, you've gone through divorce, and you can tell our young people, hey, listen to the preacher. I'm telling you, I've been through that. It's gut-wrenching. It's hard. You don't want that. There are people in this room, you have made financial blunders, and you could say to them, listen, don't make these mistakes. Take it from me. But you know what? That's a problem with the younger generation. I'll figure it out myself. No. Why? I wasn't planning to use this illustration, but I will. I've been having ear problems, and I still got an ear problem going on in my head. Now, it didn't hurt like it once, but I can't hear. And so Brother Peter Bumacod is into this acupressure. And he's got this crazy tool that he wants to like push on my foot that will make my ear feel better. Now, I've not done this because I ain't convinced. How can you push on my toe and make my ear feel better? I'm sorry, that just sounds like snake oil to me. I'm just saying. And that's what he told me last night. He said, man, I'll clear that ear out, let me do that. And he's got his little tool and he's ready to go. And he's trying to talk me into it. And he's like, now it'll hurt. He said, when I'm done, you are going to want to go to sleep. And I'm thinking, what? So first of all, you sound like a snake oil salesman. Hey, this elixir, it'll fix everything. That's what you sound like to me. And you're telling me it'll hurt. Well, I pride myself in some form of manliness, so I'm not terrified of the pain. But hold on a second, I don't like hurting just for the sake of hurting. Now, I don't get some of these people are like, pain, bring it on, I'm going to cut myself. No. Now, look, if I go out and basketball and I get hurt and play, okay, I'll do that. And let's be a little bit manly about it. I mean, we got too many sissy wimps. I understand that. But I don't just say like, oh, bam, oh, yes. No. So here's what I'm saying. If I can look at your life and you're the one that messed up and experienced the pain, I'm really cool with saying, okay, yeah, I'm not going to do that. Because I'm hoping somebody will catch me in the lobby and be like, yeah, that Peter guy, you got to watch him. He poked on my foot, it hurt like the devil, and my ear still wasn't fixed. That's what I'm wanting you to tell me. Because I will take it from you. Was that a good illustration to that? Am I making my point? Okay, all right. It made sense. Because that wasn't in my notes. That just happened last night. All right. I got 3 other points and we don't have time. We'll get to them next week. Don't worry about it. But listen to me. This king, he got an F. It wasn't this newfangled education that you can't give somebody an F because that's going to hurt their self-esteem. God's old school. He gave him an F. You failed. You should have known your history. You didn't even know to call on Daniel. You didn't learn from Nebuchadnezzar, who was a fool in his own right, but at least he got right with God and he learned from his mistakes. You failed in history and you should have been paying attention. I wonder how many this morning you say, man, there's some people that have a measure of wisdom that have been down the path that I've not gone yet. I probably ought to listen to them, that they know how to live life, and I'm going to listen to them and learn from them. Maybe you could look around and say, hey, I know that so-and-so made a mistake. I'm not going to make that same mistake. I'm going to make sure that I don't make that same mistake in my life. Let's learn from history. Let's value history. Let's enjoy history.